12 trained professionals walked away from the most secured estate in Portland. One broken man walked in and changed everything. If you've ever watched someone rebuild their life from the wreckage of everything they loved, stay with me, because this story will hit you somewhere deep. Follow this channel all the way to the end. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The morning Ethan Hale drove through the iron gates of the Sterling estate, the sky over Portland was the color of old ash, low clouds pressing down like a lid on something that didn't want to be opened. He almost didn't take the job. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been sitting across from a recruiter named Dale Fitch at an employment agency on Morrison Street, a paper coffee cup going cold between his hands, listening to Dale describe the position in the careful, measured way people describe things they're slightly afraid of. Executive Protection Specialist, Dale said. Live-in, single employer, full benefits, housing on site, private schooling allowance for dependents. He paused. Compensation is exceptional. How exceptional? Dale slid a number across the desk. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up. What's wrong with it? Dale straightened a pen on his desk. The position has had some turnover. How much turnover? 12 specialists in 11 months. Ethan set down the coffee cup. 12. The employer is, Dale searched for the right word. Particular. That was one word for it. Ethan had done his research the night before the interview, sitting at the kitchen table while Lily slept down the hall. He'd pulled up everything publicly available on Vivian Sterling, which wasn't much, and that itself was a statement. 2 years ago, her name had been everywhere. Forbes Under 40 lists, tech and logistics conference keynotes, profile pieces about the youngest female CEO, to take Sterling Logistics from a regional freight company to a national healthcare supply chain operation worth north of $400 million. Then, 18 months ago, the articles stopped. Not because the company had stumbled. Sterling Logistics had actually grown through the silence, running on momentum and a tight inner circle. The articles stopped because Vivian Sterling had stopped appearing. No conferences, no interviews, no investor dinners, no public events of any kind. The last photograph anyone had published of her was from a hospital entrance, taken without permission, grainy and distant, showing a woman in a wheelchair being pushed through sliding glass doors by a man in a dark suit. The man in the dark suit had been her security chief, Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb had been killed in the same attack that put Vivian in that wheelchair. What exactly happened that night was a matter of sealed police records and aggressive legal intervention from Sterling's attorneys. What Ethan had been able to piece together from court documents and old news items was thin. A parking structure in downtown Portland, a vehicle ambush, shots fired, one fatality, one survivor with permanent spinal injuries. The attacker or attackers had never been publicly identified. The case had been handed off to a federal investigation that appeared to have produced nothing. Vivian Sterling had gone home, locked the gates, and essentially disappeared. And 12 security professionals, one after another, had walked back out through those gates inside of a year. Ethan had stared at his laptop screen for a long time that night. Then he'd heard Lily shift in her sleep down the hall. A small sound, just a blanket moving. And he'd looked at the number Dale Fitch had written on that slip of paper, and he'd thought about Lily's school, about her shoes with the worn-through left heel, about the second-hand mattress she was sleeping on that had a dip in the middle he kept meaning to fix. He'd closed the laptop and gone to bed. In the morning, he called Dale and told him he'd take the interview. The woman who met him in the estate's main reception room was not what he'd prepared himself for. He'd expected someone brittle, someone who wore their damage on the surface, short-tempered, defensive, maybe cruel in the particular way that frightened people become cruel. 12 people walking out the door in 11 months suggested a working environment that was something close to untenable. Vivian Sterling was seated behind a desk that had been positioned to face the room's main entrance directly. She was 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back without ceremony and eyes that were the kind of gray-green that looked different depending on the light. She was wearing a plain white button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she was looking at him the way someone looks at a car they're considering buying. Not rude, just thorough. The wheelchair was a rigid frame manual model, matte black, adjusted close and tight to her body. It was not decorated or softened in any way. It was a tool, and she used it like one. "Ethan Hale," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. It makes me feel like someone's grandmother." She glanced down at the folder on her desk, which he assumed contained his resume and whatever background checks Sterling's legal team had already run on him. "Sit down." He sat. She didn't look at the folder again. She looked at him. "You were military police. 8 years." "Yes." "Then private security, 3 different firms, 6 years total." "That's right." "Your last position ended 14 months ago." She said it flatly, letting the gap sit there. "It did." "Why?" He'd prepared for this question. He'd prepared 3 different versions of the answer. Professional, deflective, technically true. He sat with them for a moment and then discarded all of them. "My wife died. I had a 7-year-old and I was barely functional for a while. I took contract work when I could get it, but nothing full-time. I'm ready to be full-time again." Vivian looked at him without changing her expression. "How did she die?" "Cancer. It moved fast, 8 months from diagnosis." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The compensation package Dale quoted you. Did it include the private schooling allowance?" He mentioned it. "There's a good school 20 minutes from here, Montessori through 8th grade. If you take this position, Lily will have a place there." She said her daughter's name without any particular emphasis, which told him she'd done her own research. That's not contingent on performance. It's part of the offer. Something tightened in his chest. Not gratitude exactly, more like the particular ache of something you've been holding at arm's length suddenly moving close. He kept his face still. "What happened to the 12 people before me?" he asked. Vivian tilted her head very slightly. Most people, he guessed, didn't ask her that directly. "Different reasons," she said. 3 quit within the first week. They found the assignment, the environment, more restrictive than they'd anticipated. She paused. "Meaning they found me difficult." "Were they right?" A beat. "Probably." "And the others?" 4 were dismissed for compromising the perimeter in various ways. 2 had their security protocols rejected. They kept designing systems that required me to ask for assistance to move between rooms. Her jaw tightened slightly on that last part. "That's a non-starter. 1 left for a higher paying position. 1, she stopped. "1 made the mistake of treating this assignment as a caregiving role rather than a security role." Ethan nodded slowly. "And you want to know if I'll do the same. I want to know if you understand the difference." He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, rather than reaching for the answer she wanted to hear. "Security is about environment and threat management," he said. "If I'm trying to help you in and out of your chair, I'm not doing security. I'm doing something else entirely. Those are 2 different jobs." She looked at him for a long time. "When can you start?" she said. He started on a Tuesday. The estate itself was substantial. A converted Victorian on 4 private acres in the West Hills, extensively renovated in a way that blended the original structure with modern extensions built low and wide and glass-faced. Beautiful, objectively. But there was something about the grounds that felt abandoned in a way that didn't match the upkeep. The hedges were trimmed, the gravel drive was raked, the security cameras were new and well-positioned, but the garden beds were empty. The chairs on the wide side terrace hadn't been moved in months. You could see the faint circular indentations where the legs had sunk slightly into the decking. There were no flowers anywhere. There were no personal items visible in any of the exterior-facing windows. It looked like a property staged for a sale that wasn't coming. The house staff were small in number and careful in manner. A housekeeper named Rosa, who had been with Vivian since before the attack, and treated the whole situation with a kind of protective quietness. A groundskeeper named Carl, who mostly stayed outside, and a part-time personal assistant named Diane, who came 3 days a week and communicated almost exclusively by text, even when she was in the same building. Marcus Webb's old security office was on the ground floor, East Wing, a room with 2 large monitors, a wall of camera feeds, a metal desk, and nothing personal in it at all. Someone had cleared it out thoroughly. Ethan set his gear bag in the corner and stood in the middle of the room for a while, just reading the space. The security system Marcus had built was good. It was more than good. It was the kind of layered, redundant architecture that came from someone who knew what they were doing and had taken the threat seriously. Motion sensors, perimeter cameras, biometric entry points, a panic room off the master suite that Ethan estimated could sustain 2 people for 72 hours. But there were problems. The interior camera layout had 2 dead zones, both in the east corridor near the kitchen, both wide enough that a person could move through them undetected for 15 to 20 seconds. Not long in absolute terms, but long enough. The panic room door had a keypad entry that required fine motor precision and would be difficult to operate quickly from a seated position. Several of the exterior motion sensors had been set to a sensitivity level that triggered constantly on wildlife, which meant the system had been effectively trained to be ignored. Ethan spent his first 3 days not introducing himself extensively to the staff, not rearranging the office, and not proposing any changes. He walked the property. He timed every route from every room to every exit. He sat in the security office in the evenings and watched 3 months of archived camera footage, fast-forwarding through the quiet stretches, stopping whenever something moved. On the 4th day, he knocked on the door of Vivian's private office. "Come in." She was behind her desk, laptop open, phone to her ear. She held up one finger, "Wait," and finished her call in under 2 minutes. It was the kind of call where she was clearly delivering a verdict rather than having a discussion. The person on the other end was talking a lot. Vivian was talking very little, but precisely. She set the phone down and looked at him. "3 issues," he said. "I'd like to walk you through them." She closed the laptop. "Go ahead." He laid out the dead zones first, showing her on a printed floor plan where they were and what a straightforward fix would look like, repositioning 2 existing cameras rather than purchasing new hardware. She looked at the plan without speaking, then the panic room keypad. "I'd like to replace it with a push-bar mechanism and a secondary biometric," he said. "Palm or wrist rather than fingertip. Faster. And the motor demand is lower." He watched her face. "Not because I think you'd have difficulty with the current setup. Because under genuine threat conditions, fine motor function degrades for everyone. This is a better design regardless." She looked at the floor plan. Something shifted in her expression, just slightly. "The motion sensor calibration is the 3rd thing," he said. "I'd like to reset the sensitivity and create a maintenance log. Right now, the system is generating enough false alerts that it's essentially been tuned out. That's a problem." Vivian was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How long to implement all of this?" 3 days for the camera repositioning and sensor recalibration. The panic room mechanism is a fabrication order. Maybe 2 weeks out. Do it." He turned to go. "Hale!" He stopped. "The others," she said. "When they came to me with security changes, they framed them as—" She paused. "They kept talking about what I needed, what I required. They couldn't get through a single conversation without using the word help." He thought about that. "I came in here and told you about 3 flaws in your existing security architecture," he said. "Because they're flaws, not because of anything else." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to her laptop. He went back to the security office and started on the camera adjustment. Lily arrived on a Friday evening, brought from their temporary apartment by Ethan's sister-in-law, Bree, who had been watching her for the week of transition. Bree pulled up in her battered Subaru, and Lily got out with her backpack and her art supply tote and her small rolling suitcase and stood at the gate looking up at the estate with enormous eyes. "Is this where we live now, Dad?" "For now, yeah. It looks like a museum." "It's just a house." Lily gave him a look that said she disagreed but was willing to let it go. She was 7 years old and looked nothing like Ethan. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking hard about something. She carried a notebook everywhere she went and filled it with drawings that were, frankly, better than anything most adults could produce. Animals, mostly. Elaborate imaginary animals with detailed patterns and names she'd invented herself. She was the kind of kid who was quiet around strangers, not because she was shy, but because she was watching, taking notes in her head, deciding what she thought. She had been through a lot in the last 2 years. She hadn't come out the other side undamaged. Ethan would have been worried if she had, but she'd come out the other side still herself, which he counted as a small miracle every single day. He showed her the suite that had been set aside for them. 2 bedrooms connected by a shared bathroom on the ground floor of the east wing with a window that looked out over the rear garden. Lily walked around both rooms slowly, touching the walls, checking the window latches with a thoroughness that made something in Ethan ache because he knew exactly where she'd learned that particular habit. "It's a lot of space," she said. "Yeah. The lady who lives here, Mrs. Sterling? Ms. Sterling. Does she know we're loud in the morning sometimes?" Ethan almost smiled. "I'll let her know." Vivian's schedule was a controlled thing. Board calls in the morning, strategy sessions via video conference through midday, operational reports in the late afternoon. She rarely moved from the office suite before noon, and when she did, it was along established routes through the interior of the house, never outside, never into the parts of the building that hadn't been specifically adapted for her access. She had not been outside in 3 months, not even onto the terrace. Ethan noticed this the way he noticed everything, without remarking on it, without flagging it, logging it quietly and letting it sit. What he did notice over the first 2 weeks was that the quality of her concentration in the late afternoons had begun to deteriorate. Not dramatically, but measurably. She would go quiet in the middle of calls, lose the thread of her own argument, stop mid-sentence, and have to restart. He caught it on the office camera feed several times, and he recognized it for what it was. Not medication, not cognitive fatigue. Something more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been in the same 4 walls for too long. He didn't say anything about it. It wasn't his place to say anything about it. But on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the weather had turned clear and cold, and the back garden was catching the low afternoon light in a way that made it look briefly beautiful, he knocked on the office door at 3:15 and said, "I'm doing a perimeter walk. The route past the east garden is clear if you want to take it." She looked up from her screen. "I'm working." "I know. I'll be passing through in about 10 minutes. He did the perimeter walk. He went past the east garden. He didn't look back toward the house. He heard the side door open 12 minutes later. She came out onto the stone path in a heavier sweater than the indoors had required, pushing herself through the first stretch of uneven gravel with the slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who had spent a lot of time getting very good at something they hadn't expected to need. She stopped about 20 feet from the door and was still for a moment, just breathing the outside air. Ethan kept moving. He didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't look directly at her. He was doing a perimeter walk. That was what he was doing. He finished the route and went back inside. The next afternoon, she came out without any mention from him. She was out there for 45 minutes. He watched the camera feed with the part of his attention that wasn't occupied by the security monitor, making sure the perimeter was clear, doing his job. The first time Lily and Vivian occupied the same space was an accident. It was a Saturday morning. Ethan was in the security office running a system update on the cameras, and Lily had apparently decided to explore the East Wing corridor with her drawing notebook, which she was theoretically not supposed to do without telling him first, and which she had definitely done before without telling him first. He caught it on the camera feed, Lily rounding the corner near the sunroom and pulling up short. Vivian was parked near the sunroom's east-facing window with a coffee mug and a tablet, doing something that might have been work or might have been nothing at all. Ethan watched the feed and held very still. Lily stood there for a second, doing her thinking hard head tilt. Then she walked toward the sunroom. He had the corridor audio on. He turned it up. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to be here," Lily was saying when the audio resolved. "I'll go back." A pause. Then Vivian's voice. "You don't have to go back." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you drawing something?" Vivian asked. "I was going to draw the garden from the window. The light's different in the morning." A beat. "I can do it from a different window." "The light is good from here," Vivian said. "You can draw from here if you want." Ethan exhaled slowly. On the camera feed, he watched Lily look around the sunroom, pick a spot on the wide windowsill about 6 feet from Vivian's position, climb up with her notebook, and begin drawing with the focused silence of a person who has found exactly what she came for. They didn't speak again for 20 minutes. From the camera, it looked like they were simply 2 people sharing a room with a good window. Then Lily said, "What are the birds called?" "The brown ones with the striped heads." "Song sparrows," Vivian said, without looking up from her tablet. "They come every morning?" Most mornings. Lily was quiet again. Then, with the particular directness of a 7-year-old who has decided to ask the thing she's been thinking, "Does your chair hurt?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly. From the camera, he couldn't see Vivian's expression. The angle was wrong. But her voice, when it came through the audio, was level. "No, it doesn't hurt. My grandmother had a chair like that for a while," Lily said, still drawing. "She said it made her arms really strong." "It does do that," Vivian said. "I could draw your chair if you wanted. I draw things people like. I drew Mr. Hale's old truck once and he cried a little bit." A very long pause. "He cried?" "Only a little. He said it was allergies." Lily paused. "It wasn't allergies." And then, faint, through the corridor audio barely registering, Ethan heard it. Vivian Sterling laughed. A real one. Short and surprised and entirely unguarded, like something that had slipped out before she'd had a chance to decide whether to allow it. Ethan sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he went back to the camera update, which still had 40 minutes left to run. The call from Graham Pierce came on a Monday morning in early November. Ethan was in the security office when it came through on Vivian's main line. He monitored all incoming calls as a matter of protocol, recording them with Vivian's knowledge and consent. He wasn't listening in real time. He caught it on the afternoon review. Pierce's voice was the kind of voice that had been carefully constructed to sound reasonable at all times, the vocal equivalent of a well-fitted suit, warm without being warm, collegial without meaning it. "Vivian, it's Graham. I'm calling because there's some concern at the board level. Nothing formal yet, just conversations. About continuity. About visibility. The Hargrove account renewal is coming up in January, and Hargrove's people have started asking questions about leadership consistency." A pause. "They want to see you, Vivian, in person. People are starting to wonder." Vivian's response was brief. "I'll be in touch, Graham." "Of course. I just think it's worth having a frank conversation about the optics. The board has been patient, but I said I'll be in touch." The call ended. Ethan listened to it twice. He noted the specific word Graham had chosen. Optics. Not capacity, not capability, not leadership. Optics. He noted that Graham Pierce had been with Sterling Logistics for 11 years, had been passed over for the CEO position twice, once for an outside hire and once for Vivian herself, and currently held the title of Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, which was a title that sounded significant and whose actual scope had been quietly narrowed over the past 2 years under Vivian's direction. He also noted that Graham had made this call on a company line on a Monday morning, which meant he wasn't worried about it being recorded. He was making a point. He wanted Vivian to know he was talking. Ethan flagged the call in the log and moved on, but he kept Graham Pierce's name open in a separate tab in his head, the way you keep a door open in a building you haven't fully cleared. The first thing that broke, before anything else broke, was a small thing. It was a Thursday evening in mid-November. Lily had come down with a cold. Nothing serious, but enough to keep her home from her new school, which she had taken to with the focused enthusiasm of a child who had been waiting for exactly this kind of environment. She was in bed with her drawing notebook and a cup of tea that Ethan had made badly. Too strong, wrong ratio of honey, and she was being good-humored about both. Ethan was at the kitchen table with his laptop doing a security audit update when Rosa came in to say that Ms. Sterling had asked if Lily needed anything from the kitchen. He looked up. "She asked?" Rosa had the carefully neutral expression of someone who found this notable but was too discreet to say so. "She did." Ethan thought for a moment. "Some plain crackers, maybe, and if there's ginger tea—" "I'll take it," Rosa said, and was already moving. He heard Lily's voice down the corridor a little while later, then Vivian's, lower. He didn't go to listen. He stayed at the kitchen table and kept his eyes on his laptop screen and told himself firmly that whatever was happening down that corridor was not his business. When Vivian came back past the kitchen 20 minutes later, she didn't stop. But she also didn't look straight ahead the way she sometimes did when she was in her head. She glanced toward the table, and when she saw him looking, she said without breaking stride, "She's fine. She wants more honey." Ethan nodded. "She always wants more honey." A pause. Vivian had stopped at the corner. "The tea you made her," she said. You're supposed to steep it for 3 minutes, not 7. And then you add the honey before the milk, not after. She rounded the corner and was gone. Ethan sat there for a second. Then he got up and went to make Lily better tea. In December, the security breach threat level shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It never is at first. It was a pattern. A car parked at the west end of the estate access road 4 mornings in a row, always different vehicles, always occupied by a single person who left before Ethan finished his perimeter walk. A delivery service making a run to the wrong address twice in 1 week, both times getting close enough to the gate for the camera to catch a clear photo of the driver, who on both occasions had spent more time looking at the estate than at the address card in his hand. A phone call to the main house line on a Sunday evening, unusual in itself, asking for a Marcus Webb, who had been dead for 18 months. None of these things, individually, amounted to anything provable. Together, they added up to something Ethan didn't like. He documented everything and said nothing to Vivian about it directly. Not yet, not without more. What he did do was quietly increase the exterior perimeter sweep schedule to twice daily and request from Dale's agency a background trace on recent inquiries about Sterling estate staffing. The trace came back within a week. 2 separate third-party research firms had made inquiries about the estate's security arrangements in the past 6 weeks. One was registered to a Shell LLC that dead-ended after 2 steps. The other had a cleaner registration, a corporate intelligence consultancy whose client list was private, but whose registered principal officer had previously worked as an external investigator for a major Portland-based commercial law firm. Ethan made a note of the law firm's name. He put it next to Graham Pierce's name in the open tab in his head. He closed nothing down yet. He just watched. On a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, Lily brought her drawing notebook to the sunroom and showed Vivian 12 pages of new animals. She'd moved on from purely invented creatures to hybrids, carefully drawn combinations of real species with precise anatomical notation in her 7-year-old handwriting. "This one is a snow leopard mixed with an eagle," Lily explained. "I called it a Strix leopard. It lives in high mountains and hunts at night." "The wing-to-body proportion is interesting," Vivian said, studying the page. "You've drawn the wingspan wider than the body length." "Because it needs to glide," Lily said, as if this were obvious. "Snow leopards don't have enough open ground to take off from a run, so it needs to be able to catch air from the rocks." Vivian looked at her. "Have you ever seen a snow leopard?" "Only in documentaries. They're hard to film. They don't like cameras." "Who does?" Vivian said, which was not entirely a joke. Lily turned to a fresh page and looked at Vivian with her evaluating, slightly sideways gaze. "Can I draw you?" Ethan, on the camera feed, went very still. He watched Vivian sit with the question for a moment. Watched her do the thing she sometimes did where her hands moved slightly on the wheels of her chair, just a centimeter each way, as if she were deciding something with her whole body rather than just her mind. "Go ahead," Vivian said. Lily drew her for 20 minutes. At the end, she tore the page out carefully and handed it to Vivian without ceremony, the way you hand someone something you made for them, like it belongs to them now, and there's nothing more to say about it. Ethan couldn't see Vivian's face in that moment, but he saw her hands close around the drawing, carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid of damaging. And he sat in the security office with the camera feeds running and the perimeter clear, and for a moment he was not thinking about Graham Pierce or unmarked cars or shell corporations. He was thinking about Lily, about how she moved through the world without armor, and how the world somehow kept being gentle with her for it. He was thinking about how much her mother would have loved the strange, quiet December in this house that was slowly, by degrees, becoming something other than what it had been. He turned the audio down and let them have their room. The drawing stayed on Vivian's desk for the rest of December. Ethan noticed it every time he came in to brief her on security updates, propped against the small lamp on the left side of the desk, Lily's pencil and crayon portrait of Vivian in her wheelchair, drawn with the particular confidence of a child who doesn't yet know she's supposed to find certain subjects difficult. Vivian had never mentioned it. She hadn't framed it or moved it somewhere more formal. She'd just left it there, the way you leave something that you want to be able to see without making a production of seeing it. He didn't comment on it. That wasn't his place. What he did notice, as December turned into January, was that Vivian's afternoon exits to the East Garden had become something close to routine. Not every day. She still missed days when the board calls ran long or the weather came in hard off the hills. But most days, she'd come out around 3, sometimes with coffee, sometimes without, and she'd move through the garden paths with the practiced efficiency she brought to everything physical, her arms working the chair across gravel and stone with a steadiness that had clearly been built over months of deliberate effort. She never asked him to join her. He never did. But his perimeter walk had, over time, adjusted its timing so that the rear garden route coincided with hers. Not intrusively, not closely, just present. She knew he was there. He knew she knew. Neither of them acknowledged it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The estate had a different quality in winter. The garden was bare, the trees stripped down to their framework, and the low afternoon light came in at a hard angle that made everything look simultaneously colder and more clearly defined. Ethan had grown up in a flat part of Ohio where winter meant gray sky from November to March, a uniform ceiling with nothing interesting in it. The West Hills winter was different. Fast-moving clouds, intermittent hard light, the kind of sky that changed its mind every hour. Lily had started drawing the winter garden from the sunroom window with what had become an almost obsessive focus. She'd filled 2 notebooks with variations on the same view. Same trees, same stone paths, same bird feeders that Rosa kept stocked, rendered differently depending on the light, the time of day, the species of bird that happened to be present. She was working something out, the way kids work things out through repetition, though Ethan couldn't have said exactly what. He'd asked her once, watching her set up at the windowsill with her new colored pencils. What is it about that particular window? Lily had thought about it with her characteristic seriousness. The trees look different when there aren't any leaves, she said. You can see how they're actually built. When they have leaves, you just see the outside. He'd looked out the window at the bare trees and thought about that for longer than he'd expected to. It was also in January that Lily's presence in the house shifted from accidental to something more structured. It started because of the rain, a week of it, hard and steady, that kept Lily inside and depleted her considerable resources for self-entertainment. She'd worked through her art supplies, she'd read everything she'd brought. She'd rearranged her bedroom furniture twice and been told firmly that twice was the limit. On the 4th day of rain, Ethan came back from a perimeter check to find Lily in the main hallway outside Vivian's office with her drawing notebook, sitting cross-legged on the floor, apparently waiting. What are you doing? Ms. Sterling said I could come show her my new drawings when she was done with her calls. Ethan looked at the closed office door. She said that? Yesterday, when I ran into her in the kitchen. Lily looked up at him. She was making tea wrong too, by the way. Everyone makes tea wrong according to you. Because everyone steeps it wrong. She turned back to her notebook and added a detail to whatever she was drawing. She said 3:30. It's 3:28. At 3:30 exactly, Vivian's office door opened from the inside. Vivian looked at Lily on the floor, then up at Ethan. You can come in, she said. It wasn't entirely clear which of them she was talking to. Lily gathered her notebook and went in. Ethan stayed in the doorway for a moment, then came in and stood to one side, which was where he usually stood when he was in the room and Vivian was working, present but not occupying the space. What followed was 45 minutes that he found himself watching with a kind of careful attention he couldn't entirely account for. Lily spread her recent drawings on the low table near the window. The Winter Garden series, several new imaginary animals, and a series of what appeared to be architectural cross-sections of invented buildings, and walked Vivian through them with the earnest thoroughness of someone presenting a portfolio, explaining each piece's origin, its logic, the specific problems she'd been trying to solve. Vivian asked questions, real ones, not adult-humoring child questions. She wanted to know the structural reasoning behind Lily's invented buildings, pointed out that one of the imaginary animals had an anatomical inconsistency in its hindquarters that Lily hadn't noticed, suggested a different approach to capturing the quality of winter light that involved observing shadows rather than the light source directly. Lily absorbed all of it without defensiveness, the way she absorbed everything she found genuinely useful, which was one of the things about her that Ethan thought she'd inherited from her mother. On the way back to their suite that evening, Lily was quiet for a while. Then she said, She's smart. She is. She knows about buildings and animals and light. She knows about a lot of things. Lily nodded, processing. She gets tired, though. Not like sleepy tired, the other kind. Ethan glanced at her. What other kind? The kind where you're tired of having to be careful all the time. Lily said it simply, as fact, without drama. Mom got that kind sometimes. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's a real kind. They walked the rest of the way to their suite without speaking, and Ethan put Lily to bed and sat in the small chair by the window in his own room for a while in the dark, not sleeping. The middle of January brought the first real test. He was running the morning perimeter check on a Tuesday when Carl flagged him from the north fence line, a section of hedgerow near the service entrance that Carl managed as part of his groundskeeping had been disturbed. Not dramatically. Branches pushed through at waist height, consistent with a person rather than an animal, fresh, probably overnight. Ethan walked the line slowly. There was nothing left behind, no equipment, no trash, no footprints in the hard, frozen ground. But the push was deliberate. Someone had stood at that fence and looked through it long enough to move the branches. Either they'd gotten what they came for, or they'd been deterred by something before they got further. He documented it, recalibrated the north sector motion sensors to a tighter sensitivity band, and added a camera to the service gate overhang. A small wide-angle unit that would have full coverage of the fence line without being visible from outside. He told Vivian about it that evening. Not to alarm her, but she'd made it clear from the beginning that she wanted full information, and he'd learned quickly that giving her filtered versions of things was both useless and counterproductive. She listened with her hands flat on the desk, which was what she did when she was absorbing something she didn't like. Timeline, she said, overnight Monday into Tuesday, between 2 and 5 a.m., based on the frost. Opportunistic or targeted? Don't know yet. I'm running a trace. Graham, she said. Not a question. More like a word she was testing the weight of. I don't have anything that connects this directly to Pierce yet. But, he held her gaze. But the corporate intelligence inquiries I flagged in December, one of the firms has a previous relationship with a legal consultancy that's done work for Pierce personally. That's 2 steps removed. It's not evidence. It's a pattern. But Vivian was quiet for a moment. The office was dim. She'd been working in low light again, the habit she'd developed when her headaches were bad, which they'd been more frequently this week. He's been calling the board individually, she said. I found out last week. Not official outreach. Social calls. Golf game invitations. Dinner. Who told you? Peter Liang. He's on the audit committee. He's been with the board for 9 years, and he called me himself because he thought I should know. She picked up a pen and set it back down. Graham is very good at this. He's had 11 years to build those relationships. What's his argument? That I'm not fit to lead. That the company needs stable, visible leadership, and I've been, she said the next word with a particular flatness, compromised. She looked at Ethan directly. He doesn't say disabled. He says compromised. He's careful about the language. He's always been careful about language. Ethan thought about the phone call he'd reviewed back in November. Optics. Graham Pierce had been working this angle for months, possibly longer. The Hargrove renewal, Ethan said. January deadline. 2 weeks? And if Hargrove doesn't renew? It's $42 million in annual contract value. It's also a signal. If a client that size pulls out, smaller clients follow. Graham knows this. Hargrove's hesitation isn't about my leadership capacity. I've run their account personally for 3 years, and the performance data is unambiguous. Their hesitation is about perception, about whether there's instability at the top. She stopped. Which Graham has been cultivating very deliberately. Ethan sat with this for a moment. He wasn't a business strategist. He didn't have a play here, but he knew threat assessment, and what he was looking at was a multi-vector pressure campaign. External surveillance to gather information, internal board cultivation to build leverage, a key client relationship being destabilized to create a deadline. Graham wasn't trying to alarm Vivian. He was trying to isolate her. Exhaust her options one by one until the path of least resistance was stepping aside. The Hargrove people, Ethan said. Have they asked to meet? Their CFO sent an inquiry last week, in person. before the renewal decision. And Vivian's hands moved on the wheels of her chair, that small, centimeter each way motion he'd come to read as the physical manifestation of a decision being weighed. I haven't responded yet. He nodded. He didn't push. It wasn't his call to push. But he went back to the security office that night and started building a revised logistics framework for a potential off-site meeting. Threat assessment for external venues, transportation requirements, communication protocols. He didn't mention it to her. He just built it, because if she decided to go, he wanted to be ready. He also started, quietly, a deeper background trace on Graham Pierce. What came back over the following week was not a bombshell. It was an accumulation. Pierce's financial records, the publicly accessible portions, showed a pattern of personal investment in a competitor logistics firm called Meridian Supply Chain Partners. Small positions, carefully structured to stay below disclosure thresholds, but consistent and growing over the past 18 months. Meridian had recently expanded its healthcare supply chain services in the Pacific Northwest. It was, in other words, a direct competitor to Sterling Logistics in its most profitable sector. Pierce held equity in the competition. Pierce was also, as Sterling's executive VP, bound by fiduciary duty to the company he was undermining. Ethan looked at the documentation for a long time. Then he printed it carefully, put it in a folder, and knocked on Vivian's office door the next morning. She read through it without speaking. When she finished, she set the folder on the desk and looked out the window for a long moment. "This is enough for a board-level disclosure inquiry," she said. "I think so. I'm not a lawyer." "No, but I have 4 of them." She closed the folder. "Where did you get this?" "Public records, financial filings, corporate registrations, nothing obtained improperly." She nodded slowly. "He's been patient," she said, almost to herself. "This has been building for a long time." A pause. "He waited until he thought I was weakest." "It looks that way." "He miscalculated something." Ethan said nothing, waiting. "He thought isolating myself meant I wasn't paying attention." She looked up. "I've been paying very close attention. I just haven't been visible." There was something different in her voice in that moment. Not louder, not harder, just more precisely itself. Like a signal that had been running at low frequency suddenly clarifying to its actual strength. Ethan picked up the folder. "I'll hold this until you tell me what you want to do with it." "Keep building the file. I want everything you can find." She turned back to her desk. "And Hale." "Yes." "The Hargrove meeting." She kept her eyes on the screen. "I'm going to respond to their CFO today." He held the folder and didn't let anything show on his face. "I'll have a logistics framework ready by end of day." She didn't look up, but something in her posture changed, just slightly. A settling, like a structure that has been braced finally accepting its own weight. He went back to the security office and got to work. The Hargrove prep took 10 days. Ethan ran venue assessments on 3 candidate locations: a hotel conference suite, a private club downtown, a Sterling Logistics facility in the Pearl District that had a board-approved meeting room. He discarded the hotel first. Too many variables, too many access points he couldn't control with the staff he had. The private club was manageable, but required a 20-minute transit route through downtown Portland traffic that he didn't love. The Pearl District facility was Sterling property, familiar, controllable. He submitted his assessment to Vivian with his recommendation. She read it, asked 2 questions about the facility's accessible entry protocol, and told him to proceed with the Pearl District location. He drove the route 4 times. He walked the facility's accessible entrance twice. He spoke with the building's security coordinator and established a temporary protocol for the day of the meeting. He arranged a vehicle, not a standard town car, not a van retrofitted with visible adaptive equipment, just a large format SUV with a rear section. Ethan modified himself with the help of a folding boarding step that packed flat and a floor anchor for the chair during transit. He told none of this to Vivian in detail. He simply presented her, 2 days before the meeting, with a logistical brief: departure time, route, arrival protocol, the meeting room setup, the return route. She read through it. She got to the vehicle modification section and paused. "You did this yourself?" "The boarding step, yes. It packs flat. It's not visible from outside the vehicle." She looked at him. "I didn't want you to have to navigate a ramp," he said, which was the honest reason and the only one he had. The step is the same height as a standard SUV running board. It's not a statement, it's just geometry. A long beat, then, fine. She handed back the brief without further comment. The night before the Hargrove meeting, Lily came to find him in the security office. It was past 9, which was past her bedtime, which she knew, and she stood in the doorway with the specific look of a child who has prepared a justification. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Go to bed." "I made something." She held out a folded piece of drawing paper. "For Miss Sterling, for tomorrow." He took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing of the Pearl District facility. Lily had clearly looked it up because the building was recognizable, with Vivian at the entrance, in her chair with a slightly different posture than Lily usually drew her, taller somehow. The drawing had a straightness to it that Lily had put in deliberately, Ethan could tell, with the specific intentionality she brought to things that mattered to her. Underneath, in her careful 7-year-old print, "You are the strongest person I know, not because of what you can do, but because of how you do it." Ethan sat with it for a moment. "That's a good sentence," he said. "I worked on it for a while." Lily shifted in the doorway. "Can you give it to her in the morning before she goes?" "Yeah, I can do that." "Don't make it weird." "I'll do my best." Lily went back to bed. Ethan sat in the security office with the folded drawing on the desk in front of him, the camera feeds running their quiet loops on the monitors, the perimeter sensors reading clear. He thought about Vivian reading the board's faces in that meeting room tomorrow, navigating the particular cruelty of having to prove herself to people who had already decided what her body meant about her mind. He thought about the 12 people who had walked out of this job before him, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes with being in a place that keeps refusing to know you. He thought about his wife, who had spent her last months making him promise things he'd mostly kept, who had told him, near the end, with her characteristic directness, "Don't disappear on Lily. Don't disappear on yourself. Find something worth showing up for." He folded the drawing back along Lily's crease marks and set it by his coffee cup where he'd see it first thing in the morning. Outside, the January night was clear and cold over the West Hills. The sky for once not doing anything complicated, just dark and full of stars going about their ancient, indifferent business. The perimeter was quiet. The house was still. Ethan turned off the overhead light, left the monitors running, and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. He gave her the drawing at 7:15 in the morning, in the kitchen, while Rosa was making coffee and Vivian was doing the thing she did most mornings, reading through overnight emails on her tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who preferred to absorb bad news before the day fully started, rather than let it find her later. He set it on the table beside her coffee cup without ceremony and didn't explain it. She looked at it. Then she unfolded it. She read Lily's sentence at the bottom and was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the others. "She was up past her bedtime making this," Vivian said. "Probably. You should tell her not to do that." "I will." Vivian folded it back carefully, along Lily's original crease lines, not her own, and set it in the interior pocket of the jacket draped over the back of her chair. She picked up her coffee and went back to her tablet. Ethan went to get the vehicle. The drive to the Pearl District took 22 minutes in the morning traffic. Ethan had timed it at different hours across the previous week and knew the variance window. He drove the route without comment, one eye on the mirrors, not because he expected anything, but because that was how he drove now, every time, and he'd stopped being able to do it differently. Vivian was in the rear seat, tablet in her lap, reviewing notes. She had dressed without fuss. Dark blazer, tailored trousers, the kind of outfit that read as deliberate without being costumed. She looked, Ethan thought, like someone who had decided exactly how much of herself to show today, and had dressed accordingly. She hadn't said much since they left the estate. When they were 4 minutes out, she set the tablet face down on her knee and looked out the window at the city passing by, buildings she probably hadn't seen from a car window in a long time. "They're going to look at the chair first," she said. Not self-pity, not bitterness, just fact. "Some of them will," Ethan said. Hargrove's CFO is a man named Daniel Reeve. He's 61 years old, has been with Hargrove for 22 years, and ran their operations division during the 2009 downturn. He's seen actual crisis. She paused. He'll look at the chair first and then he'll get over it in about 30 seconds. And the others? There are 2 others. One of them has met me before, in person, before the attack. She'll be fine. The third one I don't know. A beat. The third one concerns me. Why? Because I can't read people I don't have data on, and I don't do well with variables I can't prepare for. She said it plainly, the way she said most things about herself. Without apology, and without the slightly aggressive self-deprecation that some people use to preempt judgment. Just accurate self-knowledge, stated and left there. Ethan pulled up to the facility's accessible entrance. He got out, deployed the boarding step, opened her door. She transferred to her chair with the practiced efficiency that he'd watched become steadily smoother over the months, not without effort, but with the particular competence of someone who had put in the unglamorous hours of learning a new physical vocabulary for their body. He fell into position at her left rear quarter. Not behind her, not hovering, just present, the way a good detail operates. She pushed through the entrance and he moved with her, and they went inside. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 18 minutes. Ethan was in the corridor outside the conference room for all of it, monitoring the building's camera feeds on his phone, running a quiet scan of the facility's entrance logs every 20 minutes. Nothing unusual. The building was quiet. Whatever was happening inside the room was happening without outside interference. When the door opened, Daniel Reeve came out first, a compact, deliberate moving man with the handshake manner of someone who'd spent decades deciding quickly whether he trusted people. He said something to his colleagues, then turned and looked down the corridor. Vivian came through the door and saw Ethan and gave him a look that he'd gotten good at reading. It wasn't relief. She wasn't the kind of person whose face did relief publicly. It was something more like, "We can go now." The meeting was done, and it had gone the way it had gone, and she was finished performing the version of herself that conference rooms required. In the vehicle, on the way back, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Reeve extended the contract, full terms, 3-year renewal. That's good." He said something at the end. She looked out the window. He said he'd had his doubts going in about whether the company was going to stay stable. A pause. And then he said he watched me present for 90 minutes and his doubts went away. Not because I convinced him with the numbers, though I did, but because he said... She stopped, restarted. He said he could see that I wasn't going anywhere. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He meant it as a compliment, Vivian said. It was a compliment. I know it was a compliment. She was still for a moment. It just also happens to be the most clarifying thing anyone has said to me in a year and a half. Neither of them said anything for the remainder of the drive, but something in the vehicle felt different, a quality of the silence, like a room after a window has been opened. The Hargrove renewal was announced internally 3 days later. Ethan monitored the internal communication channels and watched the board members' responses come in. Congratulations, professionally calibrated. The kind of language people use when they're acknowledging a result that complicates their previous position without admitting it. Graham Pierce sent a 2-line email. Strong result on the Hargrove front. Looking forward to discussing the Q2 outlook at the board meeting. Ethan read it and added it to the file. Then 10 days after the Hargrove meeting, Graham made his move. It came through official channels, which was smart. Graham had always been smart about staying inside the procedural lines while doing things that weren't procedural in spirit. He submitted a formal inquiry to the board's governance committee, signed by himself and 2 other board members whose names Ethan recognized from the social call list Peter Liang had mentioned, requesting a review of the estate's security arrangements and specifically requesting documentation of Ethan Hale's professional certifications. The inquiry cited a concern about liability exposure. It noted that executive protection specialists contracted for assignments of this scope were required, under Sterling's internal risk management policies, to hold current certification from an accredited executive protection program. It noted, with the careful specificity of a document that had been drafted by someone who knew exactly what it was doing, that Ethan Hale's resume listed executive protection experience but did not include documentation of formal certification. Because it didn't exist. Not yet. Ethan had the training and the background. 8 years military police, 6 years private security across multiple contract roles. He knew the work. He could do the work. He had been doing the work. But the formal certification course, a 2-week residential program offered through a handful of accredited security training organizations, was something he'd always intended to complete and had never had the right window for. The timing, the cost, the 2 weeks of coverage for Lily. It had stayed on the list. Graham had found the gap and put a procedural knife in it. Vivian called Ethan into her office the morning the inquiry circulated. She had a printout of it on her desk, and she looked, when he came in, like someone who had been sitting with something unpleasant long enough to get past the initial reaction and into the colder, more useful anger. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Tell me about the certification." He told her the truth. All of it. What he had, what he didn't have, why the gap existed, what completing the certification would require. He didn't dress it up. He'd worked for Vivian long enough to know that she had no patience for softened versions of hard facts, and that delivering a softened version would cost him more in her estimation than the hard fact itself. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long is the course?" 2 weeks residential. The next cohort starts in 23 days at a facility in Bend. Can you complete it in that time frame? Yes. What do you need from me for coverage while you're gone? He'd already thought about this. I can bring in a contractor I've worked with before. His name is Kevin Marsh. He's solid. He knows my system. I'd brief him fully before I leave and stay reachable by phone for anything non-routine. But Vivian looked at the printout again. Graham is going to push the governance committee to require this be resolved before the next board meeting. That's in 31 days. I know. Which means if you start the course in 23 days, you finish 2 days before the board meeting. Yes. She tapped the edge of the printout against the desk, once. That's not a comfortable margin. No, it isn't. But it works. It works. She looked at him steadily. Graham is expecting me to either dismiss you preemptively, which removes you and signals weakness simultaneously, or fight the inquiry on technical grounds, which is a process that takes longer than 31 days and leaves you in a compromised position throughout. She set the printout down. He's not expecting the third option, which is that I already knew about this gap, that we've been actively addressing it, and that by the time the board meeting happens, it will be resolved. She paused. Did you already know he was going to do this? Ethan considered. I knew something was coming. The pattern suggested a procedural approach. I didn't know the specific target. But you'd looked at your own file. I look at everything. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, I'll respond to the governance committee today. I'll inform them that the certification process is already underway and will be completed prior to the board meeting. I'll frame it as a routine professional development milestone that was in progress before the inquiry. She picked up her pen. Is there anything on your record, anything at all, that Graham might use if he keeps digging? This was the question, the real one. Ethan had been waiting for it. When I was with my second security firm, he said, there was an incident involving a client, a domestic situation. The client's spouse came onto the property, and I made a physical intervention to remove him. The client declined to press charges. There was an internal review that cleared me, but the incident is in my employment file. He paused. The client's spouse was hospitalized with a broken wrist. Vivian didn't blink. You intervened in a domestic violence situation. Yes. And you broke his wrist. He had her against a wall. I made a decision about acceptable force, and I applied it. He kept his voice level. I'd make the same decision again. Was the internal review outcome documented? In full. Clearance with commendation for client protection. She looked at him for a moment. Graham will find it. Probably. And he'll frame it as evidence of instability, excessive force, liability risk. Yes. And my response to that will be to make sure Peter Liang and the 3 board members I actually trust read the full file before Graham's version reaches them. She clicked her pen open and closed. Context is everything in a document like that. The framing is Graham's whole game. Strip out context, present the surface. Let people fill in their own conclusions. She set the pen down. I'm not going to let him do that. Ethan looked at her. She said it without heat. Just the clear, practical statement of a woman who had spent years running a company and knew exactly how narrative manipulation worked at the board level because she'd watched it happen to other people, and had clearly spent the last several months watching it happen to herself. "There's something else," he said. He put the Meridian file on her desk. Not the original, a clean copy, organized chronologically, with the corporate registration documents, the financial filing extracts, and a 2-page summary he'd written himself. "I kept building this after I gave you the first version," he said. "The positions grew in November and December. He's increased his Meridian holdings by roughly 40% in the past 3 months. Vivian opened the file. She read the summary first, then went through the underlying documents with a systematic focus that told him she was cross-referencing against things she already knew. Internal company data, board timelines, things he didn't have access to. She got to the last page and closed the file. "He's been positioning Meridian to absorb Sterling's healthcare supply contracts," she said. "If I step back, voluntarily or otherwise, and the company loses the Hargrove account and 1 or 2 others in the disruption, Sterling's valuation drops. His equity in Meridian becomes significantly more valuable at exactly the moment Sterling becomes acquirable. That's what it looks like. It's not just about removing me," she said. "It's about what happens to the company after I'm gone." She sat with this for a moment. "He's been planning this for at least 18 months. The timeline of the Meridian investment starts 2 months after your attack." She was very still. "He didn't cause the attack," Ethan said, "because he needed to say it clearly. I've found nothing that suggests any connection there. This is opportunism, not orchestration." "I know," Vivian said, but something had shifted in her face. A coldness that wasn't anger, more like the specific quality of clarity that comes when a theory you've been half holding in the back of your mind becomes confirmed fact. "He saw me go down, and he started building his exit from this company's shadow. My incapacity was his runway." She closed the Meridian file. "I want to take this to the board," she said. "Not through the governance committee, directly to the full board. Emergency session." She looked up. "But not yet. Not until after you're certified and the inquiry is resolved. If I bring this to the board while Graham still has the certification issue as a live grievance, it looks like deflection, like I'm attacking him to distract from my own position. And after the certification is resolved? After that, I bring it to the board with everything clean on my side of the table, and I let this speak for itself." She pushed the file toward him. "Keep adding to it. Every position change, every contact between Graham and Meridian's principals, anything you can document." He picked up the file. "There's one more thing." She waited. "The surveillance on the property, the fence disturbance in January, the intelligence inquiries. I haven't been able to connect those directly to Graham, but the timing maps to his escalation pattern." He paused. "I don't think he's operating alone. Someone is feeding him information about the estate's internal arrangements." Vivian was quiet. Then, "You think it's someone inside?" "I think it's possible." She looked at the window. Outside, the February garden was bare and gray, the bird feeders swaying slightly in wind. "The staff has been with me a long time. Most of them, but Diane comes from an external agency. Diane has been here 2 years. I know. I'm not making an accusation. I'm telling you what the possibilities are." She nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing visible. I'm going to adjust what information flows through which channels for the next few weeks and see what shows up where. It's a slow process." "Fine." She turned back to her desk. "Hale." "Yes." "The board meeting is in 31 days. She looked at him directly. "I need you to come back from Bend certified and ready." "I will be." "And I need you to understand that if Graham succeeds in removing you before that happens, it won't be because of the certification. It'll be because I let him define the narrative. I'm not going to do that." Her voice had the level, carried quality of someone saying a thing they mean completely. "You're not getting fired." He stood with that for a moment. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Come back with the certification and give me something to work with." He went to call Kevin Marsh. The 23 days before the course were busy in the particular way of days spent doing 2 jobs simultaneously. His own work plus the preparation work of handing his own work to someone else cleanly enough that nothing would slip. Kevin Marsh arrived 4 days early, a compact, unhurried man in his late 40s who had spent 15 years in private executive protection and brought to the job a professional quietness that Ethan respected immediately. He walked Kevin through every protocol, Every camera position, every pattern he'd built into the estate's security architecture over the past months. Kevin asked good questions and didn't need things explained twice. On the third day of Kevin's orientation, Ethan introduced him to Vivian in the security office. The meeting was brief and professional. Kevin shook her hand and summarized his background without being asked, which Ethan had told him Vivian would expect. She asked him 2 questions about response protocols and seemed satisfied with the answers. After Kevin left the room, she said, "He's competent." "He is. You trust him." "I wouldn't have brought him if I didn't." She turned back to her desk. "Then go. Don't fail the course." He laughed, which surprised both of them slightly. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh in a way that wasn't just a polite acknowledgement of something mildly amusing. A real one, short and genuine, slightly involuntary. She didn't say anything about it, but when he looked at her, there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Not a smile exactly, but the particular look of a person who has just seen something they didn't expect and found, unexpectedly, that they were glad they saw it. He left for Bend on a Thursday morning. Lily had said goodbye the night before. She'd made him a folded paper card with a drawing on the front that showed a figure in a car driving toward a mountain, and inside wrote, "Come back soon. Ms. Sterling and I will keep the birds alive." He'd put it in the front pocket of his bag, where he would see it every morning. The certification course was 2 weeks of the most concentrated professional instruction Ethan had been through since military training. He was the second oldest person in the cohort, 12 specialists at various stages of their careers, from a former Secret Service agent completing a recertification to a 26-year-old from Atlanta on her first executive protection contract. The curriculum covered threat assessment frameworks, emergency medical response, vehicle dynamics, surveillance detection, legal accountability, and the particular skill set of operating as part of a principal's daily life without compromising either their security or their autonomy. That last module was taught by a woman named Carol Teague, who had spent 18 years protecting high-profile clients across 3 continents and spoke about the work with a dry, practical authority that Ethan found immediately credible. On the 3rd day of her module, she said something that Ethan wrote down in his notes and kept returning to. "The principal is not your job. The principal's safety is your job." The difference seems semantic until you're in the field, and then it's the difference between a professional and a handler. Your client is not a package you're transporting. They're a person living their life. Your job is to make that life as safe as possible while disturbing it as little as possible. The moment you start treating the principal as the problem rather than the environment as the problem, you've lost the thread. He thought about the 12 specialists who had walked away from the Sterling estate. He thought about what Vivian had said in their first meeting. "They kept designing systems that required me to ask for assistance to move between rooms." They treated her as the constraint to be managed. He treated the environment as the constraint to be managed. It had seemed obvious to him from the beginning, but hearing Carol Teague lay out the principle formally made him understand why it hadn't been obvious to the others. Because treating a person with a visible disability as a problem to be solved was a habit of mind that most people didn't know they had until it was named. He called Lily every evening. She gave him detailed reports on the birds, species, frequency, behavior, and brief diplomatic summaries of the estate's general status that suggested she was choosing her words more carefully than a 7-year-old typically would, which told him she'd picked up on the fact that the current situation was somewhat elevated. On the 8th night, she said, "Ms. Sterling is working very late. Rosa makes her tea and she doesn't drink it. Is she okay?" She's like you get when you're worried about something, but you don't want to say you're worried about it. A pause. "She does the chair wheel thing, the back and forth." "Yeah, she did it for a long time yesterday." He sat with that. "Thanks for telling me. Is the thing going to be okay?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" He wasn't entirely sure. But Lily asked the question with the specific need of a child who has already had one rug pulled out from under her and needs to know the floor is solid. And he had learned by now that there was a difference between a reassurance that was a lie and a reassurance that was a commitment. "I'm going to make it okay," he said. "That's different from sure, but it's better." A beat. "Yeah," Lily said. "Okay." He passed the certification on the final day of the course. All sections, clean, no conditions. He drove back to Portland on a Saturday morning, the certification documentation in his bag beside Lily's card, the West Hills resolving ahead of him through the windshield as he came over the highway's last rise. He'd been gone 14 days. The estate looked the same from the outside. Gates, hedgerow, the bare upper branches of the garden trees visible above the east wall. But as he pulled through the gate, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the south-facing wall of the main building, in the morning light, several new climbing plants had been installed in the ground-level beds. They weren't blooming, it was still February, but they were there, staked and planted, which meant someone had made a decision about the spring while he was gone. He parked and went inside. Rosa was in the kitchen and told him Lily was at school and Ms. Sterling was in a board call until 11. At 11:15, he knocked on the office door and came in and set the certification documentation on her desk. She looked at it. She opened the folder, checked the date, checked the issuing body, closed it. "The board meeting is in 9 days," she said. "I know." He paused. "While I was gone, did anything—" "Diane gave notice 3 days ago," Vivian said, unexpectedly. "She said it was a personal decision." He was quiet for a moment. "And the information channels I adjusted before I left?" Vivian looked at him steadily. "One of the adjusted channels had a leak. It went to a contact associated with the corporate intelligence consultancy you flagged in January." She paused. "It came from Diane's access point." He nodded slowly. "I'll document it." "I already did." She picked up a folder from the left side of her desk, not the Meridian file, a new one, and held it out. "I'm not entirely helpless when you're not here." He took the folder. It was thorough, more thorough than he'd expected, cross-referenced against the intelligence consultancy data he'd left her. She'd done it herself, he could tell from the formatting, which was less systematic than his but more interpretive, filling in logical connections between data points with a precision that came from understanding the business context he didn't have. He looked up from the folder. "This is good work." "I know how to gather information," she said. "That's not the skill I needed from you." He held the folder and thought about that. Then he thought about Carol Teague's third day, and the difference between a professional and a handler. 9 days, he said. 9 days. She turned back to her screen. "And Hale, the plants on the south wall." He stopped. "Lily picked them out," Vivian said without looking up. "She said the south wall needed something growing on it by spring. I told her she could choose." A pause. She chose well. He left the office and went to the security office and sat down and opened the new folder and started working, and outside the February morning was cold and clear over the West Hills, and somewhere across the city, Lily was in her classroom drawing things she saw and things she imagined and things that lived in the territory between them, and in 9 days it would all come to a point. And Ethan Hale sat at his desk with his certification in his bag and the work in front of him and did not look away from any of it. The 9 days passed the way the days before something difficult always pass. Too fast in the aggregate and too slow in each individual hour. Ethan spent them building. The Meridian file grew by another 12 pages as he tracked 2 additional equity position increases and a registered meeting between Graham Pierce and Meridian's CFO at a Portland restaurant on a Tuesday evening, documented by a time-stamped parking garage receipt that appeared in a public expense reimbursement filing Graham had submitted to Sterling's accounts department with what Ethan could only assume was either profound carelessness or profound arrogance. The receipt listed the restaurant's name. The restaurant's reservation system, accessed through a contact Ethan had at a commercial investigative firm, confirmed a table for 2 under Pierce's name. Meridian's CFO had a public LinkedIn profile that listed 3 speaking engagements in Portland over the past 6 months. It was circumstantial, but it was one more thread in a fabric that was becoming harder to look at as anything other than what it was. He also spent those 9 days watching Vivian prepare. He didn't watch intrusively. He watched the way he watched everything, through the regular rhythms of the job. But what he saw was a woman doing something he recognized from his military years, from the nights before operations that mattered. The specific, focused process of deciding exactly who you're going to be when the moment comes, and then building backward from that decision to make sure everything is in place to support it. She was on the phone more. Not anxious calls, strategic ones. Peter Liang twice. a board member named Sylvia Okafor, who ran a healthcare investment fund and had been Vivian's most consistent ally on the board since before the attack, a lawyer named Pratt, who specialized in corporate governance and spoke with the compressed precision of someone billing by the 6-minute increment. Vivian never put these calls on speaker when Ethan was in the room, but she also didn't lower her voice, which he took as the implicit permission it probably was. What he gathered, assembled from fragments heard across several days, was the shape of her approach. She was not going to arrive at the board meeting in a defensive posture. She was not going to respond to Graham's inquiry as though it were the primary agenda item. She was going to bring the Meridian documentation to the table herself, frame it as a fiduciary concern requiring immediate governance action, and let Graham's inquiry about Ethan's certification become, in context, exactly what it was: a procedural harassment tactic deployed by a board member with a material conflict of interest in the company's failure. It was, Ethan thought, a good plan. It required the board members he'd never met to be the kinds of people who responded to documented evidence rather than cultivated narrative. That was not guaranteed. But it was the best available play, and Vivian had clearly been thinking about it longer than the 9 days since his return. On the 7th evening before the board meeting, Lily came to the security office after dinner. She did this occasionally, not to bother him, just to keep him company in the particular way she had of keeping people company, which involved being in the same room and doing her own thing without demanding anything from the atmosphere. She settled on the low bench along the wall with her notebook and her pencil case and started drawing. Ethan kept working. For a while there was just the sound of pencil on paper and the quiet cycling of the camera feeds. Then Lily said, without looking up, "Is Ms. Sterling scared?" He considered the question. "I think she's focused. Those can be the same thing." He looked at her. She was still drawing, not looking up, the pencil moving in the careful, deliberate strokes she used when she was working on something detailed. "Yeah," he said. "They can be." "She came outside today," Lily said, "in the afternoon, but she didn't do the whole path. She just went to the end of the first section and stopped." A pause. She sat there for a long time, looking at the plants on the south wall. "They're not blooming yet." "I know, but she was looking at where they're going to be." Lily turned a page in her notebook. "I think that's a different thing than looking at what's there." Ethan sat with that. "How do you know this stuff?" Lily glanced up at him briefly. "Mom used to do it too. Look at where things were going to be." She went back to her drawing. Before she got really sick, she planted bulbs in the yard. It was October and nothing was going to happen until spring, but she kept going out to look at where she'd put them. The security office was quiet. "Did they bloom?" Ethan asked. "Yeah, that next April." Lily was quiet for a moment. "We weren't in that house anymore by then, but I like to think they did anyway." He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. After a while, Lily held up her notebook. She'd drawn the south wall, the bare climbing plants in their new beds, the stakes, the winter gray stone behind them. She'd drawn them not as they were, but as they would be, full-leafed, flowering, covering the lower third of the wall in dense green. "I'm going to give this to her before the board thing," Lily said. "That's a good idea." She looked at him. "You should get some sleep, Dad. You look tired." "I'm fine." "You always say that." She closed the notebook. "Mom used to say it too." She slid off the bench, collected her pencil case, and stopped in the doorway. "Good night?" "Good night, Lil." She went down the corridor and he listened to her footsteps, and then he turned back to his screen and sat there for a moment, not reading anything before he could pull himself back to the work. The board meeting was held at Sterling Logistics headquarters on the 16th floor of a building in the South Park blocks. It was a Tuesday morning, February 28th, overcast and cold. The kind of Portland winter day that wasn't quite raining but had made it clear that it was thinking about it. Ethan drove. Vivian was in the rear seat with a leather portfolio on her lap, and she was not doing anything with her phone or her tablet. She was just sitting, looking forward, which was different from her pre-Hargrove posture, and which he read as confidence rather than vacancy. She'd done her preparation, and she was done doing it. Lily had given her the drawing at breakfast. Vivian had looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Lily, and then said, with characteristic understatement, "This is accurate," which Lily had taken as the high compliment it was. The drawing was in Vivian's portfolio. Ethan had seen her put it there. The Sterling headquarters building had an accessible entrance off the side street that Ethan had assessed 3 days earlier. He pulled up at 7 minutes before 9, helped manage the transfer with the boarding step, and fell into position at her left as they moved toward the entrance. In the elevator, going up to 16, she said, "How many people in the building that you don't know?" "Lobby security has 3 people I haven't met. I spoke with the building's head of security last week. He knows we're coming, and he has my number. Graham will have his own people here." "I expect so. I haven't identified them yet." She nodded. The elevator rose. "If this goes the way I think it goes," she said, "Graham will get loud at some point. He tends toward managed aggression when he feels cornered, stays inside the lines but pushes hard on the emotional register." She looked at the elevator doors. "Don't react to it." "I won't." Not because it would be unprofessional, because it's exactly what he'd want. Any reaction from security personnel toward a board member gets framed as intimidation, and that becomes the story. She glanced at him. "I know you know this." "I know. You needed to say it anyway." She almost smiled. "Yes." The elevator opened. The 16th floor had a reception area and then a set of glass-walled conference rooms overlooking the South Park blocks. Through the glass, Ethan could see the board table already occupied. 7 of the 12 board members were seated, with more filtering in from the corridor. He scanned faces against the research he'd done. Peter Liang, second seat from the far end, saw Vivian come in and gave a small nod. Sylvia Okafor, near the window, looked up and her expression settled into something composed and steady. The 3 board members Graham had been cultivating were clustered at the near end of the table, and Ethan watched their faces do the thing faces do when they see something they'd been told to expect in a different form. A quick recalibration, a beat of adjustment. Graham Pierce was already seated at the table's midpoint. He was 60 years old and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who has spent decades being the most experienced person in most rooms, a physical confidence that read as authority, until you look closely enough to see that it was performance all the way down. He looked at Vivian when she came in, and his expression did something subtle and fast. Not surprise, but a slight upward revision of something, as if he'd been operating on an assessment that needed a minor update. He looked at Ethan next. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained no particular warmth. Ethan set himself at the room's perimeter, near the door, and became part of the wall. Vivian took her position at the head of the table. She didn't make a production of arranging herself. She came to the table, positioned her chair where she wanted it, set her portfolio in front of her, and opened the meeting. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I want to move through the standing items quickly because there's a governance matter I need to bring to the full board's attention before we close, and it requires time." Graham shifted in his seat. He'd expected to hold the procedural initiative. The certification inquiry was listed as the 4th item on the standing agenda, and he'd presumably planned to let it build through the first 3 items before deploying it. Vivian had just announced she was going to preempt it, and the room had heard that announcement in whatever register they were tuned to. The first 3 standing items took 35 minutes. Vivian moved through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running these meetings for years, and watching her do it, Ethan understood something he'd only partially grasped from the estate. That the boardroom was a place where she was entirely herself in a way that even the garden wasn't quite, because this was the context she'd been built for. The one in which her particular combination of precision and authority had no friction against the environment. She was, in this room, completely at home. Graham spoke twice during the standing items. Both times, Vivian answered him the same way. Directly, with data, without hostility and without any softening that could be read as concession. He was good in the room. Ethan could see why he'd survived 11 years in her orbit. But he was operating against someone who knew the ground better than he did and had stopped pretending otherwise. At the 40-minute mark, Vivian set down her pen and said, "The governance matter." She opened her portfolio and distributed copies of a document to each board member. Ethan watched the room as they received it, watched eyes move down the first page, watched the room's temperature change. "I'm placing before the board documentation of a material conflict of interest involving a member of this board," she said. "The conflict has been active for approximately 18 months and involves undisclosed equity positions in Meridian Supply Chain Partners, a direct competitor to Sterling Logistics in our primary healthcare supply vertical." She paused. "The board member in question is Graham Pierce." Graham didn't move. His face did a very controlled thing. A slight forward shift of the jaw, a deliberate relaxing of the hands on the table. He'd been caught, and he knew it, and he was deciding in real time how to handle being caught. "This is a serious allegation," he said. His voice was exactly the calibrated warmth it always was. "And I want to be clear that I intend to cooperate fully with any review process." "It's not an allegation," Vivian said. "It's a documented fact. The equity positions are in public filings. The timeline maps directly to your activity on this board over the same period." She looked around the table. "I'm requesting that the governance committee open a formal conflict of interest review and that Graham recuse himself from all board votes pending that review." The room was very quiet. Peter Liang said carefully, "Vivian, this is significant." "I'm aware. If the documentation supports what you're presenting, it does. Then the governance committee will need to convene before the end of the week." He looked down the table at Graham. Graham's hands were still flat on the table. "I'd like the opportunity to respond to this in the appropriate forum," he said. "A board meeting is not—" "You submitted a formal governance inquiry about this board's security arrangements last month," Vivian said. "You chose the forum." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "Now, the inquiry itself. My security specialist, Ethan Hale, holds full current certification from the National Executive Protection Institute, completed 14 days ago. The certification documentation has been filed with the governance committee as of this morning." She turned a page in her portfolio. "The inquiry is resolved. Are there questions?" One of Graham's 3 cultivated allies, a man named Forrest Briggs, who ran a real estate investment trust and had been on the board for 4 years, said, "Vivian, given what you've just presented, I think it's worth asking whether the inquiry itself was submitted in good faith, or whether it was—" "I'll leave that to the governance review," Vivian said. "I don't need to characterize it. The documentation will speak to the context." Graham looked at Ethan then. A long look. Not threatening, not exactly, but the kind of look that contains an acknowledgement. "You built that file." Ethan held the look without expression and without moving, which was what the job required, which was what he did. Graham looked away first. The meeting concluded 40 minutes later. The governance committee committed to convening by Thursday. Graham Pierce left the room without speaking to Vivian and without looking at Ethan again. 2 of his 3 board allies had shifted their conversational energy toward Peter Liang by the time the meeting broke up, which Ethan read as the political recalibration it was. Sylvia Okafor stopped beside Vivian on the way out. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s who carried herself with the specific ease of someone who has made a lot of money and stopped being impressed by most things. And she looked at Vivian with an expression that was warm without being performative. "I've been waiting for that for about 14 months, she said. "I know," Vivian said. "You should have done it sooner." "I wasn't ready sooner." Sylvia looked at her for a moment. "Are you ready now?" "Yes." Sylvia nodded, picked up her bag, and left. Vivian sat at the table for a moment after the room cleared, looking at nothing in particular. Ethan stayed at the perimeter until she looked at him. "Ready?" she said. He brought the vehicle around. The drive back was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then Vivian said, "He'll fight the governance review." "Probably." "It won't matter. The documentation is clean, and Pratt knows the process better than Graham's lawyers do." She looked out the window. "He might try to negotiate a quiet exit, resign before the review concludes, frame it as a personal decision. Would you accept that?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'd accept it if the recusal is immediate and complete. The Meridian positions get disclosed and divested, and he signs a non-disparagement agreement that covers the company and its leadership." A pause. "I'm not interested in punishing him publicly. I'm interested in removing him cleanly." Ethan nodded. "That's a pragmatic approach." "It's the right approach." She turned from the window. "Publicly destroying him would occupy 6 months of board attention and legal resources, and would make every future investor wonder whether there's more instability coming. A clean exit with documentation on file is better for the company." She paused. "And for me, I don't want to spend 6 months thinking about Graham Pierce." He glanced at her in the mirror. "What do you want to spend 6 months on?" She looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the window. "There's an initiative I've been developing. Healthcare logistics for underserved communities, rural access, last-mile distribution for medical supplies, and pharmaceuticals to areas that major distributors don't service profitably. She said it in the tone of someone describing something they've been holding privately for a long time. Sterling has the infrastructure. We have the relationships with healthcare networks. The gap is the operational model for the unprofitable routes. And that's a significant undertaking. It is. It needs someone who understands threat environments, operational logistics, and how to build a system that works in conditions that aren't optimal. She paused. Someone who can think about what the environment requires rather than just what's standard. He drove for a moment without speaking. Is this a job description? It's a conversation. She was quiet. I've been watching you work for 6 months. The way you approach a problem, you start with what's actually there, not with what the protocol says should be there. You adjust the system to the reality, not the other way around. That's just how the job works. For you it is. For most people it isn't. She looked at him in the mirror again, direct. I'm not asking you to stop doing what you do. The security function stays. But I need someone to co-build this initiative, and I've been through 3 consulting proposals that all started from a template rather than from the actual problem. I don't want another consultant. She stopped. I want a co-founder. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. They were on the 405, coming over the West Hills, the city laid out ahead and below in the afternoon gray. I'm not a business person, he said. I'm not a security specialist. We've managed. The risks are different. A security gap has immediate consequences. A business decision has consequences that take longer to become visible and are harder to undo. Yes. She said it without impatience. I'm not asking you to run the business. I'm asking you to help build the operational framework for one specific initiative in exactly the way you built the operational framework for this estate's security, from the ground up, based on what's actually there. A pause. With appropriate compensation, equity, not salary. You took the exit off the 405. The estate was 8 minutes away. Let me think about it, he said. That's what I expected you to say. Does that mean yes or no? It means I expected it, she said, which is different from being disappointed by it. He thought about it for all 8 of the remaining minutes, which wasn't enough to decide anything, but was enough to know that the answer he was working toward wasn't no. The following weeks had a different quality than the months before them. Not easier, exactly. There was still the governance review, still the work of documenting the full scope of Graham's conflict for the committee, still the daily security operations that didn't stop because the boardroom crisis had partially resolved. But something had decompressed. The particular tension that had lived in the estate since January, the sense of pressure being applied from outside in ways that couldn't yet be fully named, had eased enough that the house felt different. Lily noticed it first, the way she noticed most things. It's quieter, she said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of Rose's rice and her notebook, drawing something complicated. It's always quiet here, Ethan said. No, it was a different kind of quiet before, like when there's weather coming and the birds all go somewhere. She didn't look up. Now it's just regular quiet. Graham Pierce tendered his resignation from the board on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the governance committee's first session. The resignation letter, which Vivian shared with Ethan as a matter of record, was 2 paragraphs of polished corporate language that said nothing specific about anything, while conveying, in its very blankness, the complete absence of the warmth and confidence that had characterized every other piece of communication he'd ever sent. The Meridian positions were disclosed, divested within 30 days per the agreement. The non-disparagement clause was signed. Vivian read the letter once, filed it, and moved on. What she moved on to was the initiative. She called it the Access Bridge Project internally, a name Ethan thought was slightly on the nose, but kept that opinion to himself. And she began the formal development process with the same systematic focus she brought to everything that mattered. She had her core strategy team involved, her legal team, an external healthcare logistics consultant named Dr. Patricia Howe, who had spent 20 years in rural medical access work and brought to every meeting a kind of grounded, non-theoretical understanding of the problem that Ethan found immediately credible. His own role evolved over those weeks in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. It started with the threat and risk assessment side. Rural distribution routes had different exposure profiles than urban ones, and the communities the initiative was designed to serve were often in areas where traditional security frameworks simply didn't translate. He built a risk matrix that started from the actual conditions of each proposed route rather than from a standard template, and Vivian incorporated it into the operational model in a way that changed 3 of the 4 initial pilot route designs. But he found himself pulled further in than that. The operational framework required someone who could think about systems that worked under constraint, routes that were long, under-resourced, operated by small teams in conditions that didn't allow for error. This was, in a different vocabulary, exactly what security work required. You built for the hardest day, not the average day. You identified where the system would fail under pressure, and you fixed it before it failed. You didn't assume optimal conditions. He said as much to Vivian in one of the early planning sessions, and she looked at him across the table and said, "That's the first useful thing anyone has said in 2 weeks of planning meetings." Dr. Howe, who was sitting across from him, laughed. "It's not wrong." He joined the project as co-founder in mid-March, with a formal agreement in equity terms that Vivian's lawyers drafted and that Ethan had his own lawyer, a friend from his military years who had gone into private practice, review before he signed. It was not a decision he'd made lightly or quickly. He'd thought about it for 2 weeks after the drive back from the board meeting, had talked it through with Bree during a Sunday phone call, had even, in the strange quiet of a late-night security office shift, written down the reasons on a piece of paper and looked at them for a while before concluding that the list on the yes side was longer and more compelling than the list on the no side. What he hadn't told Vivian, what he probably would never tell Vivian, was that the thing that finally settled it wasn't the equity terms or the scale of the initiative or the operational challenge that genuinely engaged him. It was what Lily had said about the bulbs in October, about looking at where things were going to be. He'd spent 14 months running toward something, toward this job, this place, this specific version of the life he'd promised Lily he was going to build. And somewhere between the January fence line and the February board table and the March planning sessions, he'd realized he wasn't running toward it anymore. He was in it. And that was a different feeling entirely. Steadier, heavier in the right way, the feeling of ground under your feet that you've decided to trust. Lily's drawings had by now migrated well beyond her own bedroom. There were 3 in the kitchen, pinned to the board above the spice rack. The Winter Garden series, the last 3 in the sequence, the ones where the light had finally started changing toward spring. There were 2 in the hallway outside the sunroom. There was one in the security office that she had left there one afternoon without asking, a drawing of the estate from above, an aerial view that she'd clearly spent a long time getting right, the building's footprint, the garden paths, the south wall's new climbing plants rendered with their full summer potential. He hadn't moved it. He'd put a small piece of mounting tape on the back and put it on the wall where he could see it from his desk, and there it stayed. The one that mattered most was in Vivian's office. It wasn't the portrait Lily had drawn in December. That one was still on the desk, still propped against the small lamp. The new one was larger, a full page from Lily's largest notebook, done in colored pencil and ink. And it showed the estate in spring, the south wall covered in the climbing plants in full bloom, the garden full and green, and 3 figures in the garden, a small one and a taller one standing together near the bird feeders, and a 3rd figure in a wheelchair on the stone path nearby, looking at something in the middle distance. Lily had given it to Vivian without explanation, the way she gave most things, like they already belonged to the person she was giving them to, and she was just returning them. Vivian had put it on the wall behind her desk, where she could see it from her chair when she looked up from the screen. Ethan had seen it there during a briefing in the 3rd week of March, and he hadn't said anything about it, and Vivian hadn't said anything about it, and there was nothing that needed to be said. Outside the estate's south wall, the climbing plants had put out their first new growth, thin green shoots climbing the guide stakes toward the spring light. Still fragile, still finding their direction, but moving with the patient, deliberate certainty of living things that have decided the wall is worth the effort. The birds came back to the garden in late March. The song sparrows first, then others. Lily cataloged them in her notebook with the thoroughness of a scientist and the joy of a child, and sometimes Vivian was in the sunroom when Lily brought the notebook to compare against the window, and they sat together in the good morning light, and the house was, in those moments, something Ethan did not have a word for in English, and only sometimes found in the memories of a life that had ended and a life that had not yet been named. Showmore Spring came to the West Hills in the particular way it always did. Not with a single decisive arrival, but with a slow accumulation of small changes that you kept almost missing until one morning you looked out the window and the world had made up its mind while you weren't watching. The climbing plants on the south wall had taken hold by April. Not fully. They were still thin in places, still finding their way across the stone, but the new growth was visible from the garden path, bright green against the gray wall, moving upward with a patience that Ethan had come to find oddly reassuring. Things that grew slowly tended to hold. The Access Bridge project had its first formal pilot approval in the second week of April. 3 routes in rural Oregon, 1 in the Coast Range, 2 in the high desert east of the Cascades, serving 17 communities with populations under 2,000, most of which had been working with inadequate medical supply access for years. Not decades of catastrophic failure, just the slow, grinding inadequacy of being too far from the profitable center of things to make the standard distribution model work. The kind of problem that didn't generate headlines because it didn't happen all at once. Ethan had driven all 3 routes himself before the approval, not because the planning team hadn't done the logistics work, they had, competently, but because he needed to see what the ground actually looked like, which was always different from what the map said it looked like. He'd taken 2 days in late March, drove out alone, ate bad diner food in small towns, and came back with annotated photographs and a revised risk matrix that added 4 specific variables. The original framework had missed seasonal road conditions, the particular communications dead zones in the high desert that weren't on the standard coverage maps, the way distance from emergency services changed the acceptable threshold for operational incidents, and the human variable of working in communities where outside organizations arrived with plans and left without follow-through, which meant the project's credibility would need to be built differently than credibility was built in urban contexts. He'd presented this to Vivian and Dr. Howe in a meeting that ran 90 minutes past its scheduled end, and at the close of it, Vivian had looked at him across the table and said, "This is why I wanted you in this room." Dr. Howe had said more practically, "This changes the pilot timeline by about 6 weeks." "I know," Ethan said. "It's the right call," Vivian said. And that was that. The 6-week adjustment turned out to be closer to 4 because Dr. Howe was an efficient person when the framework was sound, and the revised operational model gave her team enough clarity to move fast on the parts that had previously been uncertain. By the end of April, the first pilot route was operational, a delivery run from a Sterling distribution hub in Bend to 4 clinics and 2 rural pharmacies in the high desert, twice weekly, with a small dedicated team of 3, a driver, a logistics coordinator, and a community liaison who was herself from one of the served towns, and who had, in the first week of operations, renegotiated 2 of the delivery windows based on her knowledge of when the clinic staff was actually present versus when the schedule said they should be. That last part was what made it work. The community liaison's name was Maya Reyes, and she was 29 years old and had grown up driving these roads and understood the gap between the official version of things and the actual version in a way that no amount of external planning could replicate. Ethan had met her during his route assessment trip and had told Vivian about her immediately. Vivian had called her directly, which was not the standard hiring process, and Maya had spent 10 minutes on the phone asking pointed questions about whether Sterling was committed long-term or whether this was a pilot that would be abandoned when the numbers didn't impress an investor. And Vivian had answered each question with the directness that Maya clearly required. And Maya had started the following Monday. 2 months in, the high desert route's on-time delivery rate was 91%, which was better than 2 of Sterling's urban routes. Dr. Howe sent Vivian a 1-line email that said, "I've been working on rural medical access for 20 years, and I've never seen a first-quarter number like that." Vivian forwarded it to Ethan without comment. He forwarded it to Maya, also without comment. Maya replied with a single word, "Obviously." He liked Maya Reyes enormously. The Coast Range pilot launched in May. The High Desert second route launched in early June. By midsummer, the Access Bridge project had served over 4,000 individual supply deliveries to underserved communities, had generated enough operational data to begin the case for a 4th route in southern Oregon, and had attracted the attention of 2 regional healthcare networks that wanted to discuss partnership arrangements. Vivian presented to both networks in person. She drove to the meetings, different venues, different cities, one in Eugene and one in Medford. And Ethan drove her, and she sat in those rooms with her portfolio and her data and the particular quality of presence she'd been developing since the Hargrove meeting, which was the presence of someone who had stopped asking for permission to take up space. She was not the same in these rooms as she had been in the early months at the estate, not fundamentally different. She was still precise, still demanding, still capable of a kind of focused severity that made people across the table sit up slightly straighter. But there was something additional, a quality that Ethan, who was not given to elaborate introspection about these things, could only describe to himself as, she had stopped waiting to see whether the room was going to accept her before she decided whether to be fully present in it. He thought about the 12 specialists who had walked away from the estate. He thought about what each of them had probably been given as their reason: difficult employer, hostile environment, impossible conditions. And he thought about how none of those things were wrong, exactly, and how they were also entirely insufficient as explanations, because what they described was not a person who was difficult. What they described was a person who was in pain and had not yet found a reason to put that pain to work instead of carrying it. She had found the reason, several of them actually. The company, the initiative, the garden, the bird feeders. A 7-year-old with a drawing notebook who had looked at Vivian Sterling and seen not a broken person who needed careful handling, but simply a person. Complete, interesting, worth drawing. Ethan thought about that sometimes when he watched the morning camera feeds. How much of what people called strength was actually just the accumulated weight of having been seen correctly by someone who didn't have an agenda about what they were supposed to be. In June, Lily finished 2nd grade at the Montessori school 20 minutes from the estate. Her class gave a small end-of-year presentation, each student presenting a project they'd worked on across the year. Lily's project was titled, in her careful print, Systems I Have Observed. It contained drawings and written observations about bird migration patterns, the structural logic of climbing plants, the way the estate's security camera positions described the shape of the things they were protecting, and a hand-drawn diagram of what she called the difference between a closed place and a safe place, which was, as best as Ethan could interpret it, a 7-year-old's theory of the distinction between isolation and security. Her teacher, a woman named Miss Farrow, who had spent 14 years in Montessori education and was not easily surprised, pulled Ethan aside after the presentation and said, with the specific expression of an educator who has encountered something she genuinely doesn't know how to categorize, I want you to know that Lily is doing something in her work that I don't usually see until much later. She's thinking about systems, not just observing them, but asking what they're for. She's always done that, Ethan said. I know. I'm telling you because I think it matters that you know how rare it is. Miss Farrow paused. She also talks about Ms. Sterling a great deal. She said Ms. Sterling taught her about shadows. For drawing light, Ethan said. She said you understand light better if you study what it leaves dark. Ms. Farrow looked at him for a moment. That's a remarkable thing to teach a 7-year-old. Vivian is a remarkable person. He said it without thinking, using her first name in a context outside the estate, without the professional framing, and for a half-second after he said it, he was aware of how it had come out, and then he let it go because it was true, and the truth of it was the only thing that mattered. On the drive home from the school presentation, Lily sat in the back seat and was quiet for a while, which usually meant she was processing something. Dad? Yeah. Do you think Miss Sterling was lonely before we came? He drove. I think she was dealing with a lot of hard things alone. That's the same as lonely. Maybe. Lily looked out the window. I don't want her to be lonely anymore. I don't think she is. How do you know? He thought about it seriously, the way Lily's questions always required. Because lonely people look at the space around them like it's empty, and she doesn't do that anymore. Lily considered this. She looks at the plants on the south wall. She does. And the birds. And the birds. Lily nodded slowly, satisfied with this as evidence. She went back to looking out the window, and Ethan drove them home through the June afternoon, the hills green above the city, the summer light doing what summer light does in the Pacific Northwest, arriving like it had always intended to stay. The security situation had stabilized in ways that Ethan appreciated but didn't allow himself to become comfortable with, because that was how perimeters failed. Not with a dramatic assault, but with a slow relaxation of attention that left a gap just when you didn't expect one. Graham Pierce had not made any further moves. His departure from the board had been followed by a quiet withdrawal from Portland's business community circles. No public appearances, no new board positions, no press. His Meridian equity positions had been divested as agreed. He had become, with remarkable speed, the kind of person about whom other people said, "Whatever happened to him?" Ethan kept a minimal monitoring file on him. Not obsessively. It was a 15-minute weekly check on publicly available information, the professional equivalent of making sure a door you've locked stays locked. Nothing in the file had warranted further action in 4 months. The surveillance activity around the estate had also ceased. Whether that was because the information pipeline through Diane had been its primary mechanism, or because Graham's exit removed the motivation, or both, Ethan couldn't say with certainty. What he could say was that the north fence line had not been disturbed since January, the anomalous vehicle patterns had not recurred, and the modified sensitivity settings on the perimeter sensors had been running cleanly without unusual triggers since February. The estate felt, for the first time since Ethan had arrived, like a home rather than a fortification. This was a distinction he hadn't let himself think about much in the earlier months, because it wasn't operationally relevant. Now he thought about it sometimes. A home and a fortification could look identical from outside. The same walls, the same gates, the same camera positions. The difference was entirely internal, whether the walls were keeping the world out or simply marking where the inside was. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened. Gradually, he supposed. The way the climbing plants had taken hold, not all at once, not on any specific morning, but across a season of small movements that added up to something you could see. In July, Vivian was invited to speak at a healthcare logistics conference in Seattle. A 2-day event, major industry attendance, the kind of keynote that would put her in front of 400 people who had been watching Sterling Logistics from a distance and forming opinions about its leadership based on her absence. She called him into the office to discuss it on a Thursday afternoon, which was 3 days after the invitation arrived, and which meant she'd spent 3 days thinking about it before she was ready to have the conversation. "Seattle," she said. "I heard. You read the invitation in the communications log." "It's my job to read the communications log." She almost smiled. 2 days. The keynote is the second morning. I'd need to be there the first evening for a dinner with the conference organizers. She set down the invitation printout. "I haven't done an overnight away from the estate since before the attack." "I know. The hotel has accessible rooms. I checked. The conference center does too. I checked when the invitation came through." She looked at him. "You already started the assessment." "I started it 3 days ago, yes." "Before I'd said yes." "Before you'd said anything." He kept his voice matter of fact. "That's how the job works. You tell me when you've decided. I tell you what I need to make it work." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" 2 days on the ground in Seattle beforehand. The hotel security coordinator needs to understand the room setup. The conference center has a stage access issue for the keynote. The standard road is steps only. There's an alternate entrance from the backstage corridor that will work, but it needs to be pre-cleared with their production team. He paused. "And I need you to tell me what you want the transition from the car to the venue to look like, because that's the part that'll be visible, and you should decide how you want it." She held his gaze. "You mean whether I want it to look like anything?" "I mean whether you want to come in through the main entrance or the accessible entrance, and whether you want me visible or back." "The main entrance," she said without hesitation, "and you stay back. This isn't a security event." "Understood." "I'm going to need to tell them about the stage access issue myself," she said. "I don't want the conference organizers to receive a list of requirements from a third party. I want to call them directly." "That makes sense." "Can you give me the name of the production contact?" "Already in your calendar, with their direct number." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know what's strange about working with you?" "Several things, probably." "You never make me feel like a project." She said it plainly, the way she said most things that mattered. Not with sentiment, not with the particular weight people sometimes put on things when they want them to land, just as a fact being stated. The people before you, Chitu, I could feel them solving me. Every adaptation, every accommodation, every careful question, I could feel the solving. She paused. You never did that. Ethan thought about Carol Teague in the Ben training room. The principal is not your job. The principal's safety is your job. I wasn't hired to solve you, he said. I know, but you could have been that kind of person anyway, and you weren't. She looked down at the invitation on the desk. I'm aware that sounds like a low bar. It isn't. No, she said quietly. It isn't. She called the Seattle conference's production contact the next morning, sorted the stage access directly, and sent Ethan a 2-line summary of what had been agreed. He drove to Seattle the following Monday, spent 2 days on the ground, came back with an operational brief that covered every transition point of both days of the conference. She read it, asked one question about the hotel elevator access timing, received his answer, and confirmed the trip. They drove to Seattle on a Friday. Rosa had packed Lily for a 2-night stay at Bree's, which Lily had received with mixed feelings. She liked Bree, but she'd also, as she told Ethan with characteristic directness, never been away from the estate for 2 nights in a row since they'd moved in, and she wanted it noted that she considered this a significant absence. It's 2 nights, Ethan said. I know how many nights it is. Lily had her arms crossed. I'm just noting it. Noted. She had, of course, made something for Vivian before they left. A small drawing, no larger than an index card, showing a stage with a figure at the podium and an audience in the dark below. The figure at the podium was in a wheelchair. The audience was rendered in attentive, forward-leaning silhouettes, the way audiences look when they're listening to something that has their full attention. Underneath, in Lily's print, tell them all of it. Vivian had held the small drawing for a moment in the doorway of the estate, the morning of their departure, and then she'd tucked it into the interior pocket of her jacket, the same place she'd put the drawing from before the Hargrove meeting. Whatever ritual that pocket represented, it was hers, and Ethan didn't ask about it. The conference went well, which is to say, it was imperfect in the way real things are imperfect, and it went well anyway. The first evening's dinner with the organizers had a moment of awkwardness when the restaurant's designated private dining room turned out to have a half step at its entrance that hadn't been in the photos and that nobody had thought to mention, and there was a 5-second beat of the kind of collective freeze that happens when people who haven't been around disability much don't know whether to help, to pretend they haven't seen the problem, or to find the nearest wall to stare at. Vivian navigated the step herself. It was a single step, manageable with momentum, and said, with the particular dryness she reserved for these moments, next time, lead with the floor plan. The organizers laughed with genuine relief, and the dinner moved on. The keynote on the second morning was 40 minutes. Ethan was at the back of the room near the production desk, and he watched it the way he watched everything, with one part of his attention on the physical environment and the rest on the quality of what was happening in the room. Vivian had decided on her entrance herself. She came in through the main stage entrance, which had been adapted per the agreement she'd made directly with the production team, and she came to the podium and arranged herself and looked out at 400 people in the kind of silence that follows an entrance that has presence in it. She talked about healthcare access, about the gap between where medical supply chains ended and where patients lived, about the structural inefficiency of a distribution system designed around profit margins that treated underserved communities as edge cases rather than as a constituency with specific needs and specific solutions. She talked about the Access Bridge project with the specificity of someone who had driven the routes in her head even when she hadn't driven them in person. Who knew the names of the clinics and the distances between them and the names of the people running them? She talked about what she'd learned in the past year and a half about building something under conditions that weren't optimal. She didn't use the word disability. She didn't need to. The chair was there, visible, unremarkable, hers. She talked about the difference between waiting for conditions to improve and learning to work with the conditions that existed, and she talked about it with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who had not chosen this lesson but had taken it seriously anyway. 400 people were quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when something honest is happening in them. Ethan stood at the back of the room and watched and thought about the woman who had been behind that desk in October, barely going outside, running a company through a screen, wearing her survival like a set of locked gates. He thought about the distance between that woman and this one. It wasn't a transformation. He distrusted the word, which implied a clean break between a before and after that real lives never provided. It was an accumulation. Every perimeter walk, every afternoon in the garden, every drawing on a windowsill, every hard conversation, every procedural battle, every moment of choosing to be present in her own life rather than managing it from behind glass. She had not become someone else. She had become more completely herself, which was a harder thing and a better one. The applause at the end of the keynote was the kind that starts before it's fully decided to start. A little uneven at the front, then catching, then full. Vivian accepted it without performing gratitude, which was the right response and the honest one. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, the conference director, a tall man named Bartlett, who had spent 20 years running healthcare industry events and had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone processing a session that had gone differently than expected, shook Vivian's hand and said, "We've had a lot of keynoters in this space. That was the first one in 4 years where I watched the room and nobody was on their phone." Vivian said, "That's a low bar for a 40-minute speech." Bartlett said, "You'd be surprised." On the drive back to Portland on Sunday afternoon, they were quiet for the first hour. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that follows something that went well when both people know it went well and there's nothing that needs to be added. Then Vivian said, "Lily's drawing. Tell them all of it." "Yeah." "Did you tell her to write that?" "No. She's 8 years old and she gave me better advice than my PR consultant." "She's 7. She'll be 8 in September, she told me." Vivian looked out the window. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without making it smaller than it is, and also without making it larger than it is." He waited. "A year ago, I was not going to be okay," she said. "I don't mean physically. I mean, I had stopped believing that the company was worth fighting for. I had stopped believing that the fight was mine." She paused. "I was very close to letting Graham have it. Not because he deserved it, because I was tired of paying the cost of the alternative." Ethan kept his hands on the wheel. "I'm telling you this because you came in when 12 other people had already decided I wasn't worth the trouble," she said. "And you didn't treat it as a troubled situation. You treated it as a job. And somewhere in the middle of that, it stopped being just a job for you. I could tell, I'm not oblivious. But you never let that complicate the work." She stopped. "That combination is rare. I wanted you to know that I know it." He drove for a moment. "You did the hard part," he said. "We both did hard parts. Yours were harder. Maybe. But a hard part done alone is just endurance. A hard part done with someone next to you is something different." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "You were next to me. That mattered." He didn't have a ready answer for that, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things don't require a response. They require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement didn't always need words. He nodded once, and she seemed to understand it for what it was, and she turned back to the window, and they drove the rest of the way to Portland in the particular silence of two people who have said the true thing and can now simply be in it. Summer deepened. The south wall's climbing plants achieved what Lily had drawn in February, not perfectly. The coverage was uneven in 2 sections where the soil drainage had been poor, but enough. Green against gray stone moving upward, the way things move when they've decided on a direction. The Access Bridge project was awarded a Regional Healthcare Innovation Grant in August, a significant one, enough to fund 2 additional pilot routes and the infrastructure for a full-time community liaison team. Ethan sat in the meeting where Vivian received the award notification and watched her read the email and then sit with it for a moment before forwarding it to Dr. Howe. And he thought about the Meridian file on his desk and the governance committee's final report, which had concluded that Graham Pierce had held material undisclosed conflicts of interest for 18 months and had used his board position to actively undermine the company's leadership. The report was filed, documented, and over. Graham Pierce had, as Vivian had predicted, become a quiet person. There were no articles, no new positions, no public presence. His name came up occasionally in peripheral business circles, and then didn't. Some things resolve with a bang, and some things resolve by becoming gradually irrelevant to the story, and the latter was, in its way, the more complete resolution. In late August, Ethan renewed his executive protection certification. Not because it was required yet. The certification had 2 years remaining. But because he'd found in the coursework a framework that genuinely improved his practice, and he wanted to update his knowledge of a surveillance detection module that had been significantly revised. He drove to Bend again, this time for 3 days rather than 2 weeks, and came back with annotated materials and 2 new contacts in the Pacific Northwest security community that he thought would be useful for the Access Bridge Project's route security assessments. He also came back, on the second evening of the 3 days, with something else. He'd been sitting in the hotel bar after the day's sessions, not drinking much, thinking about logistics for the Southern Oregon route, when he'd found himself thinking instead about what the estate would look like in autumn. Whether the climbing plants would hold their color into October or go early. Whether Lily would shift back to the winter garden drawings when the leaves came down or move on to something new. Whether the particular quality the house had acquired over the past year, that warmth that was nothing like the staged warmth of a decorator's brief, but was instead the accumulation of people actually living in a place and leaving evidence of themselves in it, would survive the season change or deepen with it. He'd thought about Vivian in the Seattle corridor after the keynote, the way she'd accepted the conference director's compliment without deflecting it and without inflating it, the way she'd looked in that moment, like a person who had arrived somewhere she'd been working toward for a long time and had enough left in her to appreciate it. He'd thought about what she'd said in the car. "You were next to me." That mattered. He'd sat in the hotel bar until the bartender started wiping down the counter with the universal signal that it was time to close out, and then he'd paid his bill and gone to his room and thought about the fact that the question he was sitting with was no longer whether the estate had become a home. It had. That was settled. The question he was actually sitting with was different and harder, and had nothing to do with security protocols or business operations, and he wasn't sure yet what to do with it, so he put it in the category of things that required patience, and came back to Portland the next day and went back to work. September arrived with the particular cool clarity that the Pacific Northwest produces in its best autumns. Sharp mornings, long golden afternoons, the kind of weather that makes you feel like the year is taking a breath before deciding what it wants to do next. Lily turned 8 on a Thursday in the 3rd week of September. Rosa made the cake, a chocolate thing with uneven frosting that Lily had helped with and that bore the evidence of that help in its irregular surface. There were candles. The kitchen table had Lily's drawings pinned to the wall behind it, the whole Winter Garden series plus newer work, and in the middle of it all was the drawing of the 3 figures in the spring garden that Vivian had given back to Lily for her birthday, reframed in a simple frame that Rosa had found because she'd said it belonged in the kitchen where everyone could see it rather than in an office. Vivian sat at the table for the first time, not in the formal dining room, not in the office, not in the sunroom. At the kitchen table, the ordinary one, with the uneven cake and the drawings on the wall and Lily bouncing slightly in her chair because she was 8 and it was her birthday and bouncing was appropriate. Ethan sat across from Vivian and watched Lily blow out the candles with the full-body commitment she brought to everything that mattered, and he thought about a conversation he'd had with his sister-in-law Bree the week before. Bree, who had known him for 15 years and had no patience for anything less than directness, had said on the phone, "You sound different." Different how? Less like someone waiting to see what happens, and more like someone who's living where they are. A pause. "It's about time. I live where I am." "You do now," Bree had said. "You didn't for a long time." He'd stayed with that for a few days, testing it against his own sense of things, and had concluded that Bree, as usual, was substantially right. The thing about healing, real healing, not the performed version, is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and find that the hard thing is over and the good thing has started. What actually happens is that one day you realize you've been having ordinary mornings for a while, that you've been watching the birds with your daughter without the specific background hum of grief that used to be present in quiet moments. That when someone asks how you're doing, the automatic fine that used to be a social reflex has become, gradually and without ceremony, the actual truth. Ethan had not stopped missing his wife. He didn't expect to, and he didn't think he should. She had been the architecture of his life for 8 years, and the absence of architecture is not something you stop feeling. You just learn to build in a way that accounts for it. What had changed was that the grief had found its right size. It no longer occupied the space where the present was supposed to be. After the cake, Lily presented her project for the year, She'd framed it as a birthday project rather than a school project, because it was hers, and she'd wanted to control its presentation. It was a drawing, one large piece, the largest she'd made, done over several weeks in ink and watercolor, of the estate from above, the same aerial view she'd given the security office 9 months earlier, but fully realized now, in color, with detail. The building, the garden, the south wall's climbing plants in autumn color, the bird feeders, the stone paths, the gate. And in the garden, 3 figures, a man and a child by the bird feeders, a woman in a wheelchair on the path between them, all 3 looking at different parts of the garden in the way that people look at things they're paying attention to. Lily had titled it, at the bottom, in her careful print, "Home is a place that knows your name." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Vivian said, "That's the best definition I've heard." Lily looked at her seriously. "I worked on it for a while." "I can tell." "It's for you," Lily said, "not for the office, for wherever you want it." Vivian looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she looked at Lily, and then she looked at Ethan, and something moved through her expression that was too private to name and too honest to hide. The look of a person who has received something they didn't know they needed until the moment they received it. "Thank you, Lily," she said, simply, without qualifying it. Lily nodded, satisfied, and asked if there was more cake. There was more cake. Rosa cut it, and they sat at the kitchen table in the September evening, the autumn light coming through the west-facing window in its long, late afternoon way, the garden visible beyond the glass, the south wall's climbing plants holding their color in the year's declining warmth. The gates of the estate stood at the end of the long gravel drive, the same iron gates they had always been. They opened in the morning when Lily went to school and closed in the evening, and stood through the night doing what gates do when they're not primarily about fear anymore, marking the inside, not barricading the outside. The cameras ran their cycles, the sensors read their clean data. The perimeter was exactly as secure as it needed to be, and no more. Ethan Hale had come through those gates 11 months ago with a paper coffee cup going cold in his hands, and a number written on a slip of paper, and a 7-year-old who thought the place looked like a museum. He had come because the number was what Lily needed, and because he had run out of reasons not to try, and because sometimes the door that opens is the one you weren't sure about, and you go through it anyway because standing outside is its own kind of failure. He had not expected to find what he found. He was not sure, looking back, that he could have recognized it if someone had described it to him in advance. This particular configuration of purpose and connection and ordinary daily weight that constituted, without announcement or ceremony, a life he wanted to be living. He was living it. That was the thing, not planning it, not approaching it, not managing it from behind professional distance. Living it, in a house that had learned to be a home, with a daughter who was going to be fine, better than fine. She was going to be extraordinary. And a partner who had rebuilt herself from the ground up without losing any of the essential self in the rebuilding. And a piece of work that mattered in the specific, unromantic way that work matters when it goes directly from your hands to a real problem in the world, and the world is a little less broken for it. It was not perfect. It was never going to be perfect. The operational model for the Southern Oregon route still had a logistics problem he hadn't solved yet. Vivian still got headaches that kept her in low light for hours, and still sometimes went too many days without going outside. And he still had to navigate the line between seeing that and not becoming someone who managed it. Lily still had mornings that started badly for reasons that traced back to a loss she would carry her whole life and process in different ways at different ages, and there was nothing to do about that except be there steadily and let her know the ground was solid. These things were true. They were also not the most important truth. The most important truth was simpler and harder to say without it sounding like less than it was. They had found each other in circumstances that were difficult for all of them, and they had chosen, each in their own way and at their own pace, to stay. That was the story. Not the triumph of the board meeting or the recognition of the conference keynote or the operational success of the Access Bridge project, though all of those things were real and earned and worth counting. The story was smaller and larger than any of those things. 3 people in a house that had learned to be a home, doing the unglamorous daily work of being present for each other, watching the climbing plants take hold on the south wall, feeding the birds that came every morning to the garden, getting through the ordinary days that turned out, in the end, to be the whole of it. The year turned toward its close. The climbing plants went dormant on the south wall but did not die. The birds moved through their seasonal patterns, and Lily cataloged them, and the notebooks filled up. And somewhere in rural Oregon, a delivery driver named Terry pulled his Sterling logistics van up to a small clinic in a high desert town at 7:15 in the morning and unloaded medical supplies that a community of 400 people needed and had waited too long to reliably have. And that was the Access Bridge project in its daily, undramatic reality, which was the only kind of reality that actually mattered. And in a house in the West Hills of Portland, Ethan Hale sat in the security office on a Tuesday evening with the camera feeds running their clean cycles and the monitors showing a quiet perimeter, and heard somewhere in the house the sound of Lily laughing at something, the full, unconsidered laugh of a kid who has forgotten to be careful, and heard a moment later Vivian's voice saying something he couldn't make out through the wall, and then Lily laughing again. He sat in the good dark of the security office and listened to the sound of his life going on in the next room. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the particular accounting that matters, everything.